What's up, everybody? This is episode number 30, the big 30 of Rolling with Reason. There is a lot of stuff that happened this weekend that I am just absolutely ecstatic to tell you guys. And then there's also a lot of, I suppose, intricate details I should fulfill within this episode to kind of maybe talk to everybody out there and kind of clear everybody's minds as far as what's going on with the podcast right now. So let's start off by saying this. For those of you that have noticed the new intricate backgrounds back here, that is the product of moving the podcast to different locations. It's also one of the primary reasons as to why we haven't been podcasting with John, because I've been doing it within kind of like my own little home studio setup where I don't really have the means to kind of get, I don't have the space to kind of like get multiple people in here. So it's been a real struggle, and I still have yet to contact John. So that sucks. I need to do that. Scold me in the comments, please, John. I know you're listening. Jesus. But yeah, so that definitely needs to happen. That needs to take place. I need to talk to John and kind of figure that thing out. Kind of thought about maybe renting out a place or maybe taking the time to try and find just another place. You know, I got plenty of friends for something like this, but being so busy, of course, as you guys know, that's kind of a hard feat for me to try and figure out. But yeah, so that's something that we're trying to figure out very adamantly. And but nonetheless, the show goes on. We're still doing these like solo-esque journaling sessions, which I don't mind, which kind of leads into, you know, what's going on as far as my day-to-day within the week, and kind of, yeah, I guess the progression of kind of what's happening in Will's life, I guess, and my opinionated views towards stuff that I don't understand. But other than that, I hope you guys had a great week. I'm so happy if you're tuning in and listening to this episode. But yeah, I guess let's get right into it. I left my job, so that was crazy. At least as far as the occupation that I'm concerned with and the organizations that I'm around, we have a saying called dragging up, which is a fancy way of saying that I quit. I quit the job. We ran into some conflicts as far as solutions and problem solving collectively as a team. And I say that from the perspective of me being somebody who is team driven and wants to kind of, even if we collectively come to this agreement that we're going to do something, even though I may not think it's to the most efficient potential that it could be at, that's acceptable if the team agrees on that, right? And but it wasn't so much as the team. I suppose it was a mixture of authoritative kind of positional figures well within higher standards or placement within the company, which is unfortunate. You know, I think they're a pretty good company for, you know, where they're at and kind of what they're doing and stuff. But it's unfortunate. But I think that's one of the ways for me to kind of handle stuff sometimes, being put in some of these predicaments, I suppose, as far as how I evaluate and kind of treat myself, right? And so I made the decision. I said, yep, I'm leaving. So I left, and now I'm on this awesome, weird, strange journey that I find myself in sometimes where I'm not sure where I'm going next, why I'm doing it, or what I want to do, or how to do it. And you know what? That's going to be all right. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to work out. It always does. And so with that kind of optimism, I think anything is achievable in that way and kind of in that manner. So that's kind of where we're going with that. But there's some crazy stuff that's kind of evolved with that, and we could definitely go a little deeper into that. And so as we kind of go a little deeper into that, I picked up a book recently from Barnes & Noble, one of my favorite places to go, even though I try to read my tech books as slowly and intricately as possible, so I've retained the information to a degree that is very conducive for my learning and future progress. But nonetheless, I you know, I have a lot of tech books, and still, though, I have to find the time to find these philosophical, kind of oriented, maybe entertainment-esque type of books for me, I suppose. And, you know, what I define as entertainment and what other people may be going for, right, is probably abstractly different than kind of what I view as entertainment. That's okay. The book in particular, though, that I'm talking about is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Or I think that's how you say his name. I suppose that's probably not a good sign that I can't remember exactly the author's name, seeing as how I just read the book. But, you know, and I'm just going to let it we're just going to push that out to the side. So, but what I'm going to say is this book was a phenomenal book. So as you guys know, I am also currently reading the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and that's a phenomenal book, and I'm reading through it. It's going very well. But I had heard numerous times throughout numerous, I believe, podcasts and just talking with people about animal farms. And I think I may have picked it up when I was younger, but I don't think I really read it, to be honest. I don't think I even tried to comprehend what was going on there. And so I, in this weird kind of circle of life kind of way, still ended up picking up the book. I saw it sitting on the Barnes & Noble shelf, and it was on one of the, I believe, kind of one of the curated shelves by the employees of Barnes & Noble. And it, or maybe it wasn't, maybe it wasn't selected, but nonetheless, it was kind of like a challenger reading kind of thing. And I thought, I've heard about this a bunch, so I just picked it up. And I also picked up 1984, so I'm going to read through that as well. Just from reading The Animal Farm, which I read in one day. It's a relatively short read. If you haven't read it, I definitely think, if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend that you read it. I think it's a good eye-opener as far as maybe the constructs or maybe the philosophical pitfalls of man, maybe to some degree. But yeah, it was an exceptional book, kind of highlighting some of the troublesome errors and era of the Soviet Union and kind of this whole slave labor implementation of government trying to better itself based on the outcomes of a revolution and pinpointing problems facilitated with things that go wrong within a state's body, pointing it to maybe false leads just to become what was the thing that they revolutioned in the first place. So it's an interesting book, right? And of course, I'm reading that while I'm reading the Gulag Archipelago, and that book is phenomenal, and it's going great. I haven't finished it though because it's quite a more in-depth read, especially if you're not acclimated with the historical events and or kind of turmoil and kind of the predicaments that they were put within. And so I suppose reading that book was kind of helpful into kind of where I'm at within the Gulag Archipelago. But nonetheless, I suppose it kind of points to, ironically, some similarities that I recently encountered within the workplace. And so I say, very broadly that part of the reason why I left was just because of this incohesiveness of team decisions, right? It's more of a independent, maybe ideologically kind of assorted, leave these guys in the field to figure it out for themselves, but when proposed with ideas, we don't collectively try and come together and try and solve the problem because that would be too much extra work and we have more important things to do, even though maybe at the current point in time that may not be quite as such the case, but that will be something that maybe one day, shall those people ever listen to this, they can kind of evaluate their own actions. But the demeanor of people when they come down into such an environment, when they are ensued, by, I suppose the guys in the field is a good way to say it, even though it's a weird similarity or synonym. I don't know, I'll cut that part out, but those guys come down into the field and it just feels like they're never satisfied, right? They're never happy, which they never should be, I suppose, to some degree, being the position that they're in for a reason. But I suppose there's a way to handle these kind of environments to a degree that is satisfactory for people. And I think in most cases, you can kind of pull the wool over people's eyes and kind of fool them into thinking specific things. But I suppose if you're dealing with somebody who's intelligent enough or maybe sophisticated enough to kind of evaluate the circumstances from top to bottom, even not being within the environment that's imposed from the top, it's kind of hard to pull the wool over that guy's eyes. And so, with that being said, I think there's just a certain kind of mannerisms that can be carried throughout construction. And I'm not saying in a way that kind of makes this weird thing where nobody can say anything. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying there's specific agitated, I suppose, cases where things are not going as smooth as they should be. And upon approaching somebody who's trying to maybe figure this out in the way that is, the best for the team, it's kind of, there's a way to speak to somebody who's within that environment trying to figure that thing out. And I suppose if the instantaneous, instinctual kind of reaction from those individuals is to make remarks that aren't necessarily prosperous, then I suppose sticking around within that environment probably isn't the healthiest for the person trying to do the thing that's better for the team. Which sucks because for the team, right, that's going to be not beneficial. And so it's hard to tell how that's going to play out over time. But maybe we could just chalk it up to being that job was drawing to an end, and maybe that is just the reason as to why I left, because maybe I was being intolerable of the suffering that's imposed by extreme boredom. But supposing that it was supporting things within my life, I think I probably should have played that decision a little bit better. But I suppose with that, that would be a statement kind of going against my own thought process that I just laid before you guys. But nonetheless, yeah, so there's this kind of thing where maybe as we get into these more managerial positions, we kind of neglect what it's like to be in the positions that were below us, or maybe we neglect the fact that there's a sense of suffering or uncohesive direction when it isn't implemented correctly to a degree. And only being able to facilitate or kind of read and work with the guys around you is going to be able to give you that kind of sense of direction and that kind of I suppose skill to be able to collaborate, with groups of guys. And being somebody who's been in a managerial position, I realized quickly that it wasn't for me. I don't it wasn't for me in the scenario that I was put in. But there's ways to go about handling things, and I think that is going to be what dictates the difference between somebody who is good within one of those managerial positions or not. I also resigned myself from that last position as well when I was in a managerial position. Um, Ironic, maybe not, but I just think I think there's a way for people to be in those positions and maneuver. And I've met some guys who are in these managerial positions, and they are extremely exceptional at what they do to the degree that it's nice working for them. There are guys and gals out there that I've worked for, and I thought it was nice working for them, and I think that should kind of be maybe a little bit of the striding successor goal for individuals within those positions, not necessarily how much money can I make or how much can I get done. And I hesitate with that second portion of that because efficiencies are definitely beneficial for sure, but I think they can only be so efficient when within a uh, big interchanging kind of complex machine that is constantly turning. And so trying to figure out how efficient is efficient enough is one part of the puzzle. But I suppose the biggest piece is just trying to flourish the prosperity amongst you and the people you're working around and with, to be able to create an awesome environment for everybody there. And I think it's easy for people to slip into these cracks of uh, just sheer negativity and nihilism for everything. And maybe I'm not using that word correctly, but it's kind of what I feel, and it just kind of comes to thought when I think about it. And it's just kind of this perspective that nothing will ever get better, and I don't think that's a good perspective to have. And I think if you've got people like that around you, the only way to try and make your environment better is to cultivate kind of this positive reinforcement structure within yourself and the people around you. And I think unfortunately, if you can't fix that amongst some of the people working around you, I don't think that's a good environment for you, and B, I think maybe they should reconsider, what it is they're doing, maybe on an individual level or basis, because it's very heavy and hard for people to carry within the work environment, let alone traversing all these other complexities that we're currently talking about. But I suppose, nonetheless, kind of moving on from kind of this self-enlightened evaluation, introspection of what happened to me recently, needless to say, as a summary, the book was a very good book. I think it's not as prevalent within the times as maybe a lot of readers assume that it could be. I think we're definitely within a distinct difference in time, but I think it's a good evaluation of tools, or it's a good evaluational tool to kind of evaluate the current times that we're in within within just the U.S. in general. They say that history has a tendency to repeat itself, so I suppose it's very well oriented to maybe read such literature and then just try and make a better educated decision about the environments that we're encompassed in. But moving right along, on the programming front, there is some awesome stuff that I was working on that I was not expecting to be as challenging as it has been for me, and that is the process of learning to formally type. And so for any of my touch typists out there, I think you could speak to the fact that if you don't learn to touch type right off the rip, and what I mean by touch typing is you don't look at the keyboard. And so if you've never done this before and you haven't challenged yourself, I highly, highly, highly recommend and challenge you to try and do this for yourself, because it is extremely difficult if you have wired your motor cortex within your brain to correspond with your fingers in a way for certain characters that weren't meant for those fingers as far as the efficiencies of touch typing goes. And so I thought I was typing fast enough, but I read this thing that said, hey, if you actually learn to touch type, you could ease up the cognitive load. And then there was also a podcast with Lex Friedman and I believe a programmer by the name of DHH, who he owns a platform service, but he's a very creative programmer-esque type of individual. And I was really driving with the kind of conversations and the things that he was bringing up as far as concepts and things of that. But so he kind of talks about this, if you can type very adequately, you can remove this kind of cognitive overload that can persist while you're trying to program. And I think that's definitely, I definitely think that's true, because it only makes sense, right? If you can play the guitar without looking at the strings, it makes it easier to play. And I think the same thing can be attributed to typing. But the hard part is you're trying to rewire your motor cortex. So the part of your brain that's working with these neurons that are firing to the fingertips and doing all this cool stuff, you're kind of like re-teaching yourself from scratch. But the problem is you have to learn scratch, and then you have to navigate through the pain and the struggle to be able to move yourself in the direction of progress. And so when you pair that and couple it with programming at the same time, the cognitive load that is imposed upon my brain made me question so much. And so there was definitely a crazy thing I was navigating there. There was a crazy kind of ideas just being thrust upon my brain, like, is this worth it? Like, why do I even program? Like, all kinds of crazy stuff. And I thought, oh, it's just because this is actually really, really hard. But like once you start getting the hang of it, it feels fulfilling. And there's a couple times where I kind of got in this groove, in this almost like flow state where I was making next to no errors. And that's one of the most important problems if you're going to take on an endeavor like this is just making sure that you're not hitting the wrong keys, right? If you hit the wrong keys, then you're not actually learning, and you're messing up the remapping of your motor cortex, and it's not good. So, but yeah, as I was navigating this thing, I was finding it tremendously hard, but as I just kept imposing my will upon myself, I realized that it's going to be so worth it, and so I'm figuring that out. But as far as going through the programming concepts, it kind of slowed that down to a degree that was not wanted to say in the least amount of detail. I wanted it to just like instantaneously click, but that's not how it goes when you try and do hard stuff, right? That's kind of a fallacy I kind of had amongst myself. But I suppose that as I keep traversing that new skill, it can only get better, and then it'll be worth it. But yeah, so with that being said, the thing that was, I think, the hardest within that was just trying to retouch up on and go over the concepts that we're working on in Django, from the Django for Beginners by William S. Vincent. And I also actually had the pleasure of taking some time to myself at some point to kind of take a break from the typing, but I didn't want to cognitively overload myself with trying to do the programming thing within the same Notion and then mixing different typing styles. But I watched a kind of presentation that was from DjangoCon of last year, of 2025, and he was just talking about the implementations of the user models and how they're kind of a little elaborate for what would be considered as a beginner or somebody kind of new web development and Python programming in general. I listened to a podcast recently, I suppose, to kind of segue out of that part of programming. It was tough going over the Django stuff, and I just kept rereading and implementing as slowly but accurately as I could with the new touch typing seal. But to move into something else that I listened to recently was the Lex Friedman most recent podcast. I love listening to Lex. He has some very insightful interview conversations with individuals that I think are very rewarding in terms of the knowledge that I feel like I'm gaining from what he's talking about, who he's talking to in particular, right? These specialists, not only these specialists in fields that I think are highly intertangled and intertwined with the stuff that I'm fascinated with and I'm trying to learn by doing the programming stuff that I'm doing, but he's also talking to people that are highly, I suppose, well thought out to a degree that lets them kind of have this psychological aspect in view of what is the planet and the society that we live on today. And so with that being said, it just feels like these conversations are inspiring to a degree that is very, very motivating. It's a motivator, I would say, for sure. And he's a very hard worker, and he's also working within the AI industry. I believe he is working over at some prestigious college, but he's a very, very informative guy, and I really like the conversation that he's having. He also had a conversation with another individual, and I'm blanking, but I suppose that's okay. I can't remember it all. But some guy who runs this kind of rainforest arrangement where he's trying to save the Amazon, I believe, and Lex is taking a big part in helping with that, and that guy is making big strides and saving it. Some elaborate stories that guy had to tell for sure, and just even kind of this concept of, running into tribes that have never been seen before, uncontacted. But I don't want to give the wrong impression there, and he was very adamant about that within the interview. We don't want people, going there and then trying to contact these tribes that have been uncontacted, where these scenarios have happened before within society, and it doesn't end too well for the people that try and, contact these tribes. Just because I think the disconnect is so vast for those kind of smaller group societies that it's hard for them to even, they just see us, and I think they may think that we're a threat. But even in the encounter that was revealed on Lex's podcast with that individual was astonishing. There was a video footage of it, how it took place, and you could just kind of see what's happening, and the maneuvers within that podcast was tremendously insane. But I suppose it just touches back on the fact, like Lex is putting out good content. And this is just coming from a place of listening to him a lot. I've thought about maybe sending him an email and kind of trying to discuss some of the things that run through my head sometimes, but I suppose I don't realistically have time for that, and it would be slight for me to say that, not slight, I suppose it would be hard to maybe think that, yeah, I don't know, that's an interesting question, an interesting thought. I'll leave that in and let you guys kind of interpret that yourselves as what you thought. Maybe I was going to say there I was feeling there. But moving right along, let's talk about jiu-jitsu for a minute. My ankle is steadily getting better, so that's very cool. But I don't think we're going to compete in the month of February. I was actually thinking about going down to Austin, Texas, and flying down there. But with the rapid job change and that makes it a little difficult to make these hasty kind of decisions as far as competing. Plus, the ankle just genuinely isn't feeling good. But the kind of roles and the techniques that I am working on right now, I think, are proving extremely beneficial on the mats right now. I'm receiving and seeing good compliments and results from what is taking place on the mats right now, and so that's very fulfilling. That makes me feel good, right? Being somebody who is frequently looking at jiu-jitsu related content material and working with stuff like the Octopus 2.0 guard, which I'm steadily working on. It's I find the hardest part is there's a portion where you're kind of in this position where you don't have your hips raised yet, but you have your frames in place, and so you're trying to figure out how to slide your elbow underneath of your torso effectively to kind of frame up off of the mat effectively. And so that's kind of one of the one of the problemsome um, hurdles that I'm trying to overcome with that. But nonetheless, I'm trying to figure that out, and I'm definitely heading in the right direction as far as that's concerned. I've been working on my ankle lock game, so the Aoki lock, straight ankle locks, kind of going like this inside ashi, outside ashi kind of setup. So going very well, kind of figuring out placement for various points, kind of trying to do this defensive thing, but I find maybe with the couple of guys that I've rolled with recently, and I was doing these leg locks, maybe necessarily didn't know how to re-attack to enforce a defensive mechanism, and so maybe I wasn't putting my own defensive kind of thoughts into better consideration as what it could have been. But I know that that thought is there, and it's definitely persisting, and so that's all right. But as I think, as long as I acknowledge it and I kind of have that in the back of my head, I think we're going to be okay. But so with that being said, I think that's going great. Jiu-jitsu is going great. The programming was a little struggle. The touch typing has been something cool. The job change, occupational switch up is always something interesting for me, and I think the way that we approach that individually is going to be what is the determining factor of whether or not we are prosperous in that kind of switch, or if we just kind of let it be the downfall of what is the human experience in life. And I think in my case, I am going to let it be the prosperous change. Kind of to touch back onto why we are here and why you see this green screen just one more time. I maybe have ran into some just differences, and that's okay. That's a part of life, right? And so what I've elected to do is kind of shelter myself and isolate myself into environments that I think are extremely oriented towards my goals and my mindsets, and I think that's going to be that's a big determining factor, right? I was kind of talking about surrounding yourself within the occupational environment with positive individuals and being optimistic as opposed to being extremely negative and pessimistic. I think it's very good to be in those environments. I think those environments are going to be the ones that kind of push us to be the best versions of ourselves. And with that being said, I think I kind of had to make the change and kind of force myself into this isolation to try and find the best version of myself and the biggest consistency. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out and navigate. So, John, since I haven't texted you, baby, if you're listening to this, try to figure it out. I hope we figure it out. I am adamantly trying to just figure out this life thing. And I know that you being in this position at one point in time, you definitely know what it feels like. So I'm navigating that. I will be sure to get a hold of you very soon because I miss our conversations, man. But yeah, I think that's going to be a good closer for this episode. I think something to kind of take away from it, I suppose anybody that's listening, is nothing's easy. Octopus 2.0 guard, that's not easy for my jiu-jitsu guys out there. You know, you gotta keep grinding and working through it. You know, even if you're giving away side control and you're getting just absolutely crushed. You know, taking the time to figure out those techniques and work in what's working right for you is going to be the best factor for kind of solving that problem. And it should also be said too that, you know, anytime that we find ourselves within these environments like, our occupations, it should be evaluated with the utmost importance to make sure that we're in an environment that is very aligned with kind of how we feel about the whole occupational, I suppose, thing. And that's a hard thing for people to discern for themselves, I think, especially for myself. But those are things that I think that we have to evaluate to be able to be happy, I guess. But happy is a vague, broad term. And human existence, I think, in part, Nietzsche got right when he said that a part of it is suffering. And so figuring that out is our own kind of experiences and adventures that we'll take upon ourselves. But figuring that out and doing that and just knowing that even if you're learning something as simple as touch typing, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take practice, it's going to take time. But with practice and with a little bit of effort and elbow grease, I think we can figure this stuff out. But don't be naive, right? History does repeat itself. So maybe evaluate what it is that you're learning. Maybe all this touch typing that I'm learning will be obsolete because of the use of AI for the procedural process of using agents to code applications. Who knows? But I think if I wasn't typing and then I just stuck to less efficient programming, I wouldn't be as happy. that's a choice I've made for myself. And so, with that being said, I think everybody needs to make their own choices for what you feel like is maybe orienting you in the right direction and what you feel is right for yourself. It's only something that you can determine, my friend. And so, with that being said, I think this is going to be a good closer for episode number 3030 of Rolling with a Reason. If you guys tuned in, thank you so much. I would love it if you guys would leave some comments. I would love to interact with you guys. Of course, I say that, but I'm having a hard time texting John. So, yeah. Listen, leave comments. I'll leave polls. I'm sure I'll check them at some point when I go to upload the next video, more than likely, and then I'll try and get back to you guys. But if you guys listen to this, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a nice, awesome week. If you're listening to this on your commutes, I hope it makes your commutes easier. I know for me personally, I got that hour drive, so it's a little treacherous. And podcasting and listening to Lex helps me a lot. But, yep, without further ado, that's going to conclude this episode. Thanks, everybody. Peace.